There is a kind of silence that offers no comfort. It doesn't drift in gently with the settling dust of evening or the soft pull of curtains at day's end. It strikes without warning, like a door slamming in a house you were certain stood empty. When it comes, it leaves behind something unnameable. That was the silence that descended upon Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th, 1837. By dawn, 43 people had vanished. No bodies were found. No signs of struggle marked the floors or fields. No official explanation was ever entered into any ledger. The men hired to uncover the truth abandoned their inquiries with unsettling haste, as though answers were less welcome than the questions themselves. What remained was a plantation house, still glowing with candlelight. A dining table laid for 9. Chairs pushed neatly beneath it. The air warm, as if its occupants had only just stepped outside and might return at any moment. The first man to walk the grounds the following morning later confessed to a neighbor that he had never felt fear in a place the way he felt it there. He couldn't explain why. That was what troubled him most, and it should trouble you too. Before we return to that October night in the Carra Night, back country, you should know why the story of Harrow Hall was buried for nearly 40 years, and why those who tried to bring it back into the light were quietly, carefully discouraged from doing so. Now, let us go back to 1837. To understand what happened at Harrow Hall, you must first understand what it was. Not merely a property, not simply a name inked on a deed, but a self-contained world. It moved to its own rhythm, obeyed its own unwritten laws. Those who lived there understood those rules instinctively, without ever needing to speak them aloud. The plantation lay roughly 18 miles east of a small trading settlement known as Barracks Crossing, a place that no longer appears on modern maps. In the 1820s, surveyors marked it as a loose gathering of buildings near a narrow creek that eventually fed into the Petee River. The land surrounding Harrow Hall was flat and dense, as though it swallowed light instead of reflecting it. The tree line pressed close from every direction, shrinking the sky overhead. In autumn, the cotton fields that had endured the long, punishing summer stood stripped and skeletal. The harvest had been picked, ginned, and baled, leaving behind brittle stalks that rattled in the October wind, a sound one visitor once described as somewhere between a whisper and the clatter of bones. The main house itself had been built in the early 1810s by Cornelius Tanner, a man who had come south from Virginia with enough money to purchase 500 acres and the determination to make something lasting of them. Harrow Hall was not extravagant by the standards of the grand coastal estates. There were no towering white columns, no sweeping oak-lined avenue leading to its entrance. Instead, the structure was sturdy and purposeful, much like the man who raised it. Each beam was carefully squared. Every board fitted tight. The kitchen stood apart from the house, as did the smokehouse and the cotton gin building, arranged deliberately, each structure part of a system that had functioned without interruption for decades, until the night it didn't. There was a well near the yard, a barn large enough for a dozen animals, and behind the main house, set back from it by perhaps 200 yards, the rows of slave cabins that housed the men, women, and children who made every inch of Harrow Hall possible. By 1837, Cornelius Tanner had been dead for 6 years. The plantation passed to his only surviving son, Elias Tanner, who was 34 years old at the time of our story. Recently married to a woman named Elelena Vance, the daughter of a merchant family from Columbia, and deeply, almost frantically concerned with maintaining the appearance of prosperity that his father had worked so hard to establish. Elias Tanner was not a cruel man in the way that cruelty announces itself. He was not given to rages, not known as a man who took pleasure in the exercise of power for its own sake. He was, in the words of a neighboring landowner who later gave testimony regarding the events of October 1837, a man who did what the situation required of him and called it order. That distinction between deliberate malice and the quiet institutional violence of simply maintaining a system is one that historians have wrestled with ever since. But the people who lived in those cabins behind the main house did not have the luxury of such distinctions. For them, the shape of Elias Tanner's character mattered far less than the shape of the world he controlled. Elelena Tanner was a more complex figure than her husband. She had come to Harrow Hall as a bride at 22, bringing with her a piano, 3 crates of household goods, and a sensibility shaped by a Gentile upbringing that had kept her for most of her life at a comfortable distance from the realities of where her family's prosperity ultimately came from. She was not ignorant. She was, by the standards of her time and place, well read, and there were letters among her papers discovered decades later that suggested a private moral reckoning that she never allowed to surface in any visible way. What she chose to do with that reckoning, or what she chose not to do, became in time one of the more troubling questions surrounding the events of that October night. The third member of the Tanner household, at least among those who lived inside the main house, was Garrett, Elias's younger brother, who occupied the 2 rooms at the back of the second floor, and who had arrived at Harrow Hall in the spring of 1836 under circumstances that were never entirely explained to anyone's satisfaction. Garrett Tanner was 28 in 1837. He had spent several years in Charleston doing what precisely no one was willing to say plainly, though the word debts appeared in more than one account of his history, and he had come to Harrow Hall, it seemed, not out of brotherly affection, but out of necessity. He and Elias maintained a relationship of civil distance. They ate at the same table. They did not, as far as anyone could determine, trust each other. And then there was Ward Driscoll. If any single figure in this story requires careful introduction, it is Ward Driscoll. He arrived at Harrow Hall in March of 1837, 7 months before the October night that would make the Plantation a subject of whispered speculation across 2 counties. Hired as overseer following the abrupt departure of his predecessor, a man named Clifton Haywood, whose own leaving had been sudden enough to generate its own quiet rumors. Haywood had overseen Harrow Hall's enslaved workforce, for 3 years, and his departure, which he made at night, with his belongings packed and his horse saddled before anyone in the main house was awake, was not in itself an event that Elias Tanner had any particular interest in explaining. Overseers came and went. The work continued. But Haywood's departure was not simply a professional resignation. The men and women in the cabins behind the main house knew things about why Clifton Haywood had left in the dark that Elias Tanner did not. And the arrival of Ward Driscoll, the man who replaced him, changed the atmosphere of Harrow Hall in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Driscoll was a tall man, lean in the way of someone who had spent years in physical labor, with a pale and weathered face that seemed to have settled into a permanent expression of assessment, as if he were always measuring the distance between where he stood and where he needed to be. He came with a single letter of recommendation from a plantation near the North Carolina border, signed by a landowner named Gideon Falk, who described Driscoll as a man of decisive character and firm principles, well suited to the management of a large property. What Falk did not mention, what was only discovered later through the kind of patient archival work that takes decades and requires someone stubborn enough to keep looking, was that Driscoll had fee Falk's employment under circumstances that bore a striking resemblance to the way Clifton Haywood had left Harrow Hall at night without notice, with a silence behind him that no one wanted to disturb. By the summer of 1837, the world of Harrow Hall had settled into a new rhythm under Driscoll's oversight, a rhythm that everyone inside those gates could feel, but that no official document no letter, no record of any kind, would ever fully capture. And underneath that rhythm, in the spaces between the visible and the documented, something was being planned, something patient, something careful, something that had been years, perhaps longer, in the making. History has a tendency to record the names of the people in the main house. It is less reliable about the names of the people who built it, maintained it, fed it, and made everything inside it possible. But those names existed. They appear in fragments, in estate inventories, in church records, in the accounts of abolitionists who traveled through the South, collecting testimony in the years that followed, and piecing them together is one of the only honest ways to tell this story. Reuben was 41 years old in the autumn of 1837. He had been at Harrow Hall since the age of 7, brought there by Cornelius Tanner from a property in Virginia, and he had spent those 34 years accumulating the kind of knowledge that comes only from long, close observation of a place and its people. He knew the land. He knew which section of the low field flooded in a wet spring. He knew which boards in the cotton gin creaked in a particular way that meant they needed replacing. He knew the names of every animal in the barn, and could tell from the sound of a mule's step whether it was favoring a leg. He was favoring a leg. He was, in the estimation of virtually everyone who had any dealings with Harrow Hall during those years, indispensable, biled, and he had spent a significant portion of his life understanding exactly what that meant and exactly what it did not. Reuben was tall, spare, and deliberate in his movements, with a face that had learned through long practice to express only what he chose to express. He spoke little around the people in the main house, around his own people, in the cabins, in the quiet moments after the work was done, and before it began again. He was different. He was the kind of man that others turned toward without being quite sure why, the way a compass needle turns. Not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because he was steady in a way that made other people feel steadier. His wife, Dia, was 36. She worked in the main house, in the kitchen primarily, but also in whatever capacity Elena Tanner required her presence, which meant that Dia moved through the main house with a freedom of physical access that was unusual, and that, as we will see, mattered enormously in the weeks leading up to October 14th. Dia was sharp in the way of someone who had been forced by circumstance to understand people quickly and completely, because understanding people was for her a matter of survival. She read rooms the way a sailor reads weather with attention to small signals that others might dismiss. A change in the angle of a shoulder, the way a sentence ended a half-beat too quickly, the direction a man's eyes moved when he was told something he didn't believe. She had been reading Ward Driscoll since the week he arrived, and what she read had frightened her in a way that the previous overseer, for all his faults, had not. It was not what Driscoll did that frightened her. It was the quality of attention he paid to things that other men in his position never bothered to notice. He watched, he remembered, he catalogued. He had, within his first 2 months at Harrow Hall, learned more about the internal life of the cabins, the relationships, the small economies of trust and favor that existed among the enslaved community, than Clifton Hayward had learned in 3 years, and he had done it without appearing to try. That was the thing that made Dia's stomach turn cold when she thought about it at night. Driscoll was not careless. He was the opposite of careless, and a man like that in the position he occupied with the authority he held was a different and more dangerous thing than a man who was simply brutal. The third figure at the center of this story was August. He was 19 years old, the youngest of the 3 in terms of the role he played in what happened, but not in terms of understanding. August had been born at Harrow Hall, the son of a man named Henry, who had died when August was 12, and a woman named Nora, who had been sold away to a property in Georgia when August was 15. He had, in the 2 years since his mother's sale, become something quieter and harder than he had been before, in the way that a stone becomes harder when the water that surrounded it is removed, and the air gets to it. He was not bitter in any way that showed outwardly. He worked with a focus that Driscoll had noted approvingly in the first weeks of his arrival, which meant that August had achieved the rare and difficult thing of being noticed as capable without being noticed as dangerous. But August had something that neither Reuben's steadiness nor Dia's perceptiveness could provide. He could read, not well, not fluently, but enough. He had learned in the way that enslaved people who learned anything in the antebellum South had learned covertly, in fragments at enormous personal risk, from sources that were never the same, twice. A page from a discarded almanac, the label on a crate, the back of a broadside, nailed to a post-it at Barracks Crossing. Over years of this, he had assembled something functional, not literacy in any formal sense, but the ability to decode enough of a written document to understand its essential content, and in the summer of 1837, a document had come to Harrow Hall that August very much needed to understand. The letter arrived at Harrow Hall in July of 1837, addressed to Elias Tanner, carried from Barracks Crossing by a boy who made the postal run 3 times a week on a sway-backed mare. It was a routine delivery, among several others, a bill of lading, a copy of a Columbia newspaper, a note from Elena's mother, and it was opened at the dining-room table by Elias Tanner on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of July, while Dia cleared the breakfast things around him. She did not read over his shoulder. She did not need to. She watched his face. Elias Tanner was not a man given to visible emotion, but as he read that letter, a single page, folded once, sealed with plain wax, something happened behind his eyes that Dia had never seen before. It was not anger. It was something closer to calculation. The rapid internal movement of a man reassessing a situation he had thought was under control and discovering that it was not. He folded the letter, placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, and left the dining room without finish. In his coffee, Dilea finished clearing the table. She went to the kitchen. She set down the plates. She was carrying with a care that was excessive for the situation, the careful movements of a person managing something inside themselves that they cannot afford to let out. Then she went to find Reuben. She did not tell him what she had seen. Not yet. She was not certain enough. But she filed it in the precise, orderly archive that she maintained behind the composed surface of her daily life. And she waited. 3 days later, she found the letter. It had not been hidden in any sophisticated way. Elias had placed it in the top drawer of the writing desk in his study, a room that Dia entered twice a week to dust, and that Elias, in his confidence that the letter was simply another administrative document in a drawer full of them, had not thought to secure. She did not take it. She would not have been able to explain a missing letter, and she was too careful for that kind of exposure. Instead, she memorized what she could of its first paragraph, which was enough, and closed the drawer, and left the room, and waited for the right moment to find August. The letter was from a land agent in Columbia named Pearl Oates. Its content, as best as August was later able to reconstruct from what Dia had memorized of the key passage, was this. Elias Tanner had at some point in the preceding years Ken on a substantial debt secured against Harrow Hall's enslaved population. The debt was overdue. The agent was writing to inform Tanner that if the balance was not satisfied before the end of the calendar year, the creditor, a man whose name appeared in the letter, but the Dia had not been able to commit to memory, would move to enforce the security, which meant, in plain language, a forced sale, not of the land, not of the house, or the cotton gin, or the barn, or the livestock, of the people, all of them, or enough of them to satisfy what was owed, which, by the agent's estimation, might mean as many as 30 individuals. In a community of 43, 30 was not a partial dissolution. It was an end. August sat with this information for a long time before he brought it to Reuben. He sat with it the way you sit with something that has changed the shape of your world and that you cannot unknow. Then, on a Sunday evening in late July, when the light came low and orange across the stubble fields, and the air smelled of the particular mixture of dust and cooling earth that August had known all his life, he went to find the older man. Reuben listened without interrupting. He sat on the step of his cabin, his hands clasped between his knees, his face doing that thing it did, that absolute deliberate stillness, and he listened until August had said everything there was to say. Then he was quiet, for a long time. Then he said in a voice too low to carry, "How long do we have?" August told him, "Until the end of December, at the latest." Reuben nodded. He looked out across the fields at the failing light, at the familiar landscape of a place where he had spent 34 years of his life. He looked at it with the specific quality of attention of a man who is considering the possibility that he is seeing something for the last time and deciding very quietly what to do about it. "Then we have until October," he said. "Maybe November, not longer." August did not ask him why those months. Specifically, he understood. October was when the cotton was in, when the year's work was finished, when the ground was dry, and the nights were long enough to matter. He understood because he had spent his entire life paying attention to exactly these things. What he did not yet understand was that Reuben had been thinking about this possibility, not this specific letter, not this specific creditor, but the fundamental instability of their situation and what it might eventually require for much longer than July of 1837. Much, much longer. There were things that Reuben carried in him that he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. Things that had to do not with Harrow Hall alone, but with the wider world, the geography of it, the routes through it, the names of people in places he had never been. Ute knew existed. To explain how Reuben had come to know what he knew, you have to go back several years. You have to go back to a summer evening in 1833, when a man named Tobias, a free black carpenter from a town called Lancaster, some 50 miles to the north, came to do repair work on the roof of the Harrow Hall barn and stayed for 3 days. Tobias was not just a carpenter. That is to say, carpentry was what he did for money, and he was good at it. But it was not the only work he performed on those 3 days at Harrow Hall. On the evening of his second day, while Elias Tanner was away at Bereric's Crossing conducting business, Tobias and Reuben sat together in the barn until very late. And what passed between them was something that Reuben had held inside him ever since, with the care of a man who understands that certain kinds of knowledge are both precious and perilous. Tobias told Reuben about routes, specific routes with specific landmarks, a creek crossing here, a particular ridgeline there, the location of a safe house attached to a Quaker family 17 miles north, Dage, and a second contact point beyond that. He told Reuben about timing, why autumn was better than spring, why new moon nights were preferable to full ones, why a Sunday departure, when the distance between the moment of disappearance and the moment of formal discovery was longest, was worth planning for. He told Reuben all of this in the specific practical language of a man who had helped others travel this route before, and who expected to help others again. Reuben had listened to every word. He had asked questions, careful, specific questions, the kind that told Tobias that the man across from him was not overwhelmed, was not dreaming, but was processing information with the disciplined attention of someone who understood that this knowledge might one day be the difference between everything and nothing. When Tobias left the following morning, roof repaired, payment received, not another word exchanged about what had been discussed. Reuben spent 3 days doing nothing except working and thinking. Then he began to plan slowly, carefully over the following years, without ever allowing what he was planning to become visible in anything he said or did. He talked to people, not all at once, not in any way that could be described as a meeting, one at a time, in the most natural of settings, in the field, in the barn. On Sunday evenings, he had conversations that would have sounded to any observer like nothing more than ordinary exchanges between people who had lived alongside each other for years. But they were not ordinary exchanges. They were an assessment. He was learning who among the 42 other people at Harrow Hall would be willing to go, who was strong enough, not physically alone, but in that harder, deeper sense, who had ties elsewhere that would hold them back, who had children young enough to carry and old enough to walk. He was calculating weight, distance, risk, and will. By July of 1837, when August brought him Dear's news about the letter from Purcell Oates, Reuben had been at this work for 4 years. He had not told even Dear the full extent of it, not because he didn't trust her, but because in a world where discovery could come from any direction at any time, knowing less was sometimes the safest form of protection. But now the timetable had changed. What had been a long, careful preparation with an unspecified future destination had become something with a deadline. And the first thing that changed about the plan once Reuben allowed himself to acknowledge the urgency was that he had to start telling people things he had not told them yet. That process of expanding the circle of bringing more people into the knowledge of what was being planned began in August of 1837. And continued with extraordinary care through September and into the first week of October. It was by any measure one of the most disciplined acts of collective planning that the Carolina Bacchant had ever produced. And because it was done by people who had been rendered legally invisible by the society around them, almost no record of it was ever made. Almost no record, but not quite none. Second week of September, 1837, Elias Tanner gave permission for the Harrow Hall enslaved community to attend a Methodist camp meeting at a site called Peavy Grove, approximately 4 miles from the plantation. This was not unusual. Camp meetings, those great outdoor religious gatherings that swept through the South periodically, drawing both white and black attendees in numbers that could reach the hundreds, had become a fixture of backcountry life by the 1830s, and many plantation owners, Elias Tanner among them, permitted their enslaved workers to attend them. The reasons were various and not always philanthropic. Some believed the Methodist emphasis on discipline and order served their interests. Others simply knew that the social release of a camp meeting reduced temporarily the pressure that otherwise built in a captive community. With nowhere to go, he interviewed Hiram Cook, the hired man, James and Elias Tanner, who had been located at a neighbor's property, where he had apparently gone the previous afternoon. A timing that would become one of several details that investigators noted as unusual, though none of them ever pressed it fully. Eleanor Tanner was in the main house when Baines arrived. She had by that point been alone in the house since the previous evening, or so she said. She gave her account calmly in the careful language of a woman who had spent years managed in her expressions. She told Baines she had heard nothing unusual in the night. She had gone to bed at her normal hour. She had awakened to find the house as he was now seeing it. Baines recorded her account. He wrote in the report he filed with the county court 3 days later that Mrs. Tanner appeared composed and cooperative. He did not record what she did not tell him. What she did not tell him, what would only emerge decades later from a source that none of the original investigators had thought to consult, is a subject we will return to. What Baines did in his 4 hours at Harrow Hall was establish the basic facts. 43, 3 enslaved individuals were unaccounted for. Number violence was evident at the site. The escape, for that was what he called it in his report, without apparent surprise or editorializing, appeared to have taken place during the night of October 14th. He initiated what the relevant statutes required: notification to neighboring county sheriffs, a description of the missing individuals to be circulated through the standard channels, a request for any information regarding the passage of a large group through the region on the night of the 14th. Those requests produced in the following 2 weeks exactly nothing. Not a single report of a sighting. Not a single witness who had seen a large group moving through the back country on the night of October 14th, or the days follow. Not one informant, and there were informants in every county of the Carolina back country. Men who made part of their income reporting on the movements of runaway individuals or groups who had anything useful to contribute. This was itself extraordinary. A group of 43 people moving through populated territory in the middle of October should have been visible to someone. The absence of any sighting report was not conclusive. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it was even to a man as unsentimental as Porter Baines worth noting. He noted it in a single line at the end of his report. No reliable information has been received regarding the current location of the said individuals. And then, as far as the official record was concerned, the inquiry ended. Just when we thought the investigation was leading somewhere, just when it seemed like someone in authority was going to ask the questions that needed asking, the silence closed in again. Not the silence of a plantation at night, the silence of men with authority choosing not to look too hard. If this story is already making your skin crawl, share it with someone who loves unsolved history and hit that like button so more people can hear what actually happened here. Because the real story, the story of why nobody found anything and what someone was hiding and what Elias Tanner knew, is only just beginning. The official record of the Harrow Hall investigation, such as it was, runs to approximately 12 pages. Baines's initial report, 3 pages of witness statements, a document recording the formal notification of neighboring jurisdictions, and a brief summary filed 6 weeks later, noting that the investigation had produced no actionable results and was being placed in abeyance pending new information. That final document, the one placing the inquiry in abeyance, was filed on November 29, 1837, and signed by Porter Baines and countersigned by the county judge, a man named Harlan Voss. It is the last official document in the Harrow Hall file for that year. It is also, on careful inspection, a deeply unusual document. The first unusual thing about it is the speed. 6 weeks from the disappearance of 43 people to the formal suspension of an investigation was, by the standards of the era, remarkably fast, particularly for an event of this scale. The disappearance of 4 or 5 individuals from a single plantation was not uncommon in the Carolina back country, and those investigations routinely continued for months. The disappearance of 43 was unprecedented in living memory, and the formal closure of inquiry after 6 weeks was a departure from normal procedure, so significant that at least one legal scholar examining the file in the 1890s described it as an administrative anomaly without obvious expert. Nation. The second unusual thing is a gap in the file. Between the initial witness statements and Baines's November summary, there should be, based on the normal structure of such investigations, a series of intermediate documents, follow-up reports from neighboring counties, records of any individuals detained and interviewed in connection with the case, notes from any additional witness interviews. These documents are not in the file. They are not referenced in the November summary, as having been received and found unhelpful. They simply are not there. The file goes from the initial October documents directly to the November closure with nothing in between. This could, of course, have a number of mundane explanations. Documents are lost, misfiled, damaged, destroyed by accident. Archives in the antebellum South were not maintained with the rigor of a modern records management system. The absence of intermediate documents does not by itself prove anything, but it is the third unusual thing about the file that is hardest to explain away. In the November summary, Baines wrote the following sentence, which does not appear to relate to anything else in the document and which has no obvious reference in the preceding text. The matter having been reviewed with appropriate parties and the circumstances being of a kind that do not benefit from extended public inquiry, it is the judgment of this office that the foregoing case be closed. The circumstances being of a kind that do not benefit from extended public inquiry. That sentence is not standard legal language. It is not a formula that appears in any other document in the county records from that period. It is a sentence written by a specific man to say a specific thing that someone somewhere had made a determination about what it was, and was not desirable to pursue in the matter of Harrow Hall, who those appropriate parties were. Porter Baines never identified. He died in 1851, leaving no memoir, no private papers, no correspondence that anyone has found that addresses the Harrow Hall matter. The county judge, Harlan Voss, died in 1858. His papers were inherited by his son, who destroyed most of them following a fire that damaged his home in 1862, a fire that the local newspaper described as accidental and that no one had any particular reason at the time to question. The trail, in other words, went cold in the way that trails go cold, when the people who might have followed them chose not to. There is a detail in the Harrow Hall story that the official record acknowledges and then almost immediately drops, and it is the detail that, once noticed, is the hardest to stop thinking about. When Porter Baines arrived on the morning of October 15th, Elias Tanner was not at Harrow Hall. He was at the neighboring property of a man named Abner Pruitt, a farmer who owned a modest piece of land about a mile and a half to the south. Tanner had gone to Pruitt's property on the afternoon of October 14th. Hours before the departure of his entire enslaved workforce, and had stayed overnight, arriving back at Harrow Hall on the morning of the 15th, just before noon, roughly an hour after Baines had begun his investigation. The official explanation for this absence, as recorded in Baines's report, was that Tanner had gone to discuss a fence boundary dispute that had been ongoing between the two properties. Pruitt corroborated this in his own statement. Tanner had come in the afternoon. They had discussed the fence question over supper, and Tanner had stayed the night because the hour was late. This was plausible. Fence disputes were a constant feature of backcountry life. Overnight stays between neighboring landowners were not unusual. Baines apparently accepted it without pressing further, but there are several things about this account that, when placed alongside the other elements of the story, create a discomfort that the official record does not address. The first is the timing. Elias Tanner left Harrow Hall on the afternoon of October 14th, the day of the departure, hours before it occurred. He was not present when his workforce walked out. Whether this was coincidence or design, his absence ensured that he was not in a position to respond in real time to whatever signal might have reached him from the property. The second is Abner Pruitt himself. In the years following October 1837, Pruitt continued to operate his farm without any apparent disruption to his circumstances. He was not wealthy, not politically connected, not a figure of any particular prominence in the county. He appeared, in short, to be exactly what the official record described him as, a neighbor. But his name appears in one other context, that the official record does not mention. In 1834, Abner Puit had briefly employed as a hired hand for the spring planting season a man named Tobias, a free black carpenter from Lancaster. The same Tobias who had come to repair the Harrow Hall barn roof in the summer of 1833 and had spent 3 days there in conversation with Reuben. Whether this connection means anything, whether Puit's relationship with Tobias had any bearing on the events of October 14th, is something that cannot be established from the surviving record. It might be coincidence. In a world this small, in a county this sparsely populated, connections between individuals were often unremarkable. People knew each other. People hired the same workers across seasons and properties. But in a story that has already produced this many coincidences, another one presses against the edges of comfort, and there is the matter of Eleanor Tanner. Eleanor Tanner was alone in the main house on the night of October 14th, 1837. Her husband was at Abner Pruitt's farm. Her brother-in-law, Garrett, was by her account, and by the account recorded in Baines's report, at Berwick's Crossing, where he had gone 2 days earlier and had not yet returned. This meant that on the night when 43 people walked out of Harrow Hall, the only person in the main house was Eleanor. She had prepared the supper table. She had set out the food. She had, at some point in the evening, closed the piano lid, but not entirely, leaving the sheet music in place. The lid resting at an angle against the stand. She had gone to bed, and she had heard nothing. This is what she told Porter Baines, and this is what the official record contains. She heard nothing. She saw nothing. She had no warning and no prior knowledge. The question of whether this was true occupied the mind of one person for a very long time, a woman named Adeline Spratt. A woman named Adeline Spratt, the granddaughter of Eleanor, Tanner's personal seamstress, a free woman of color from Columbia named Grace, who had made occasional visits to Harrow Hall in the years before 1837, and who had, according to family history, passed down through Adeline's line, maintained a correspondence with Eleanor Tanner for several years after the events of that October night. Adeline Spratt was 3 years old, in 1875, when she gave the testimony that is in many ways the most important document in the entire Harrow Hall story. She gave it to a journalist named Oliver Hatch, who was working for a paper in Columbia and who had become interested in the story through a chance encounter with the partial Baines report in the county archive. Hatch had spent 2 years looking for anyone who might have direct knowledge of the events of 1837, and when he found Adeline Spratt, he found something he had not expected. She had letters. The correspondence between Eleanor Tanner and Grace, Adeline Spratt's grandmother, had continued from 1838 until 1851, when Grace died. 11 letters survived, held in a box that Grace had kept, and that had passed to her daughter and then to Adeline. They were not for the most part letters that addressed the events of October 14th directly. Eleanor Tanner was too careful for that, had been by 1838 sufficiently shaped by the experience of living in a world where letters could be read by unintended eyes, that she rarely said plainly what she meant, but she said it in other ways. The most significant letter is dated March 12, 1842. It was written 4.5 years after the night of October 14th, and it concerns ostensibly a subject entirely unrelated to Harrow Hall, a piece of blue fabric that Eleanor was trying to source from a mercer in Columbia. But embedded, D, in the letter, with the particular indirection of a woman writing carefully, is this passage. I have thought often of what you said, when last we met, about the nature of actions that cannot be undone, and whether it is better to carry them in silence, or to speak them to someone who will understand. I have decided, as I believe I was always going to decide, though it took me time to arrive at it, that silence is sometimes its own kind of truth. There are things I know about that November, things I have never spoken of to E or to anyone who might bring them back into the light. I do not repent of what I chose not to do, nor of what I chose to do, which may amount to the same thing in the end. I am well. I trust you are also well. The fabric, when you find it, should be a deep blue, and not the pale color they sold me last year, which was unsuitable. I do not repent of what I chose not to do. She said November, not October, the month in which she had given her testimony to Baines, not the night itself, but the sentence preceding it makes the reference clear enough. What did Eleanor Tanner choose not to do? The most direct interpretation, the one that Oliver Hatch arrived at in 1875, and that historians who have since worked with this letter have generally supported, is this. Eleanor Tanner, alone in the main house on the night of October 14th, knew what was happening, or suspect. Said it strongly enough that the distinction between knowing and suspecting was largely academic. She heard the silence fall over the cabins, a silence she had lived with the sounds of her entire adult life at Harrow Hall, and would have recognized the sudden complete alteration of. She understood or intuited what that silence meant, and she chose not to raise an alarm. She could have. She had access to the property's bell, the large iron bell used to signal emergencies and summon workers mounted on a post at the edge of the yard. She could have gone to the neighboring property for help. It was dark. It was late, but it was not impossible. She could have done something she chose not to. Whether this was a principled act, a woman who had spent years in private, moral reckoning, finally making a choice that aligned with what she had always known to be right, or whether it was something more complicated, more ambivalent, more frightened, is something we cannot determine from a letter about blue fabric. What we can say is that the silence that fell over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th was maintained in the main house by a woman who heard it, and understood it, and let it stand. That was its own kind of courage. In a world where courage took more shapes than the official record was usually willing to acknowledge, there is one more figure whose fate requires accounting, and it's the one whose disappearance the official record found most awkward to explain. Ward Driscoll. When Porter Baines arrived at Harrow Hall on the morning of October 15th and conducted his investigation, Ward Driscoll was not present. His quarters, a room attached to the back of the barn, separate from both the main house and the cabins, were occupied. His belongings were there, his tools of office were in their usual places. His horse was in the barn, but Ward Driscoll was not. Baines noted this in his report, and recorded it as a point requiring explanation. He listed Driscoll among the individuals whose whereabouts were unknown, not alongside the enslaved community, but as a separate category, with the neutral administrative language of someone who has found something he doesn't quite know what to do with. The investigation produced no answer. Driscoll was never located, no account of his subsequent whereabouts, a new position on another property, a return to North Carolina, any verifiable life, activity after October 14th, 1837, was ever established. He simply vanished from the record. The way a man can vanish from a record when no one with the authority to investigate his disappearance has a strong interest in doing so. The question of what happened to Ward Driscoll is the question that the Harrow Hall story has never been able to fully answer. There are several possibilities, Anne. Detail. Each of them says something different about what happened on that October night. The first possibility is that Driscoll discovered the departure in progress, that his watchful, varied rounds finally brought him to the right place, at the right moment, and that he attempted to intervene, and was stopped. The absence of violence at the site makes this harder to sustain as a simple narrative, but it does not rule it out entirely. A man stopped in the dark by people who had everything to lose in a situation where the alternative to silence was catastrophic. An encounter like that would not have left broken doors or scattered belongings behind. Whatever passed between them could have slipped through the night without disturbing a single cabin wall or footprint in the yard. One possibility is that Ward Driscoll discovered what was unfolding and, for reasons known only to him, chose not to interfere. He was a man with a history of abrupt departures himself, 2 prior posts abandoned under cover of darkness, questions trailing behind him like loose thread. On the night of October 14th, perhaps he saw what was happening at Harrow Hall and made a calculation that had nothing to do with loyalty to Elias Tanner. Maybe he recognized something inevitable. Maybe he understood that what had begun could not be stopped, and that to attempt to stop it would tie his name to a failure too large to survive. Maybe men in his position were paid to prevent precisely this kind of event. In a world where reputation was currency, the loss of 43 enslaved people in a single night would have been professional ruin. There is a third possibility, one never addressed in any official record, but difficult to dismiss once considered, that Driscoll was not surprised at all, that he had known in advance, that the weeks he spent observing the people of Harrow Hall had revealed more than routine movements and quiet conversations, that what he saw and what he contemplated alone in the loft above the barn stirred something in him that neither his recommendation from Gideon Folk nor his years enforcing the very system he served would have predicted. Perhaps he watched them, and in the end he chose to look away. We cannot know. What remains is absence, a horse left in its stall, personal effects undisturbed on a shelf, a man who was present and then was not. Like so much about Harrow Hall, it resists resolution. What became of the 43 people who walked away from Harrow Hall on October 14th, 1837? Answering that question consumed the final decades of journalist Oliver Hatch's life. In 1875, he located Adeline Spratt in Columbia and began assembling what had been scattered across memory and fragile paper trails, church registries, private letters, testimonies, and the deliberately fragment records of the Underground Railroad. By the time of his death in 1892, Hatch had established this. 27 of the 43 reached free territory. Their route led north from the South Carolina back country through North Carolina into the western counties of Virginia and onward through the mountains, avoiding coastal roads where patrols were thickest. The journey, by Hatch's best estimate, lasted 11 days. 11 days on foot, with children, carrying only what they could manage, moving under darkness, resting in hidden spaces provided by people who risked fines, imprisonment, or worse. Of those 27, Hatch traced the later lives of 17. Some settled in Pennsylvania, others continued farther north. 2 eventually crossed into Canada. One woman, identified only as Phoebe, was living in Ohio by 1875. She had become the matriarch of a family of 11, grandmother to children who knew the word plantation only as history. Hatch described her as possessing such composure and clarity that an hour in her company transformed his understanding of what had been achieved at Harrow Hall. He never found Reuben. Records confirm Reuben reached the first contact point, a Quaker safe house north of Lancaster. After that, the trail faded in a way that suggested not death, but deliberate concealment. A man who had spent 4 years engineering the most carefully planned escape. P in the county would not announce himself upon reaching freedom. If he survived, and Hatch believed he did, he likely continued what he had always done best: remain unseen. Hatch suspected August settled near Philadelphia by 1840. A Quaker record mentions a young man of the correct age and description arriving in the winter of 1838, eager to learn and already literate. The entry listed only a first name. Of the 16 who did not reach free territory, those who remained behind or were separated early, the documentation grows thinner, harsher. Interrogations followed swiftly. Official records note that no actionable information was obtained. That much was true. Those who stayed had been intentionally shielded from knowledge that could endanger others. Deer, however, reached freedom. The proof lies in a single letter dated January 4th, 1838, written in an unpracticed but careful hand. It was addressed to a woman in Colombia. The writer declined to name her location, but confirmed her safe arrival. She expressed gratitude for what cannot be named, and concluded with a line that stands as one of the few direct statements about that night. What was done with full knowledge and full will. The letter was signed with a single initial, D. Hatch believed it was Dear. The handwriting suggested someone who had learned to write later in life, under constraint. The date aligned with the timeline. The phrasing carried the tone of someone aware she might be writing for history, even if history consisted of only one fragile page. Full knowledge, full will. As for Elias Tanner, neighbors described him in the months after October 14th as unsettled, distracted, a man who had glimpsed something he could neither deny nor describe. Remarkably, he did not aggressively pursue legal remedies. Under South Carolina law, enslaved people were property, and owners were entitled to seek recovery and damages. Yet no vigorous legal campaign followed. The debt that had accelerated Reuben's plan was settled in February 1838 at a steep discount, suggesting the creditor understood the security was gone. Tanner remained at Harrow Hall for 4 more years before selling it. In 1841, he moved to Columbia and died in 1853. His obituary praised his industry and character. It mentioned nothing of October 1837. No wife, no children, no vanishing. When Oliver Hatch met Adeline Spratt in 1875, she was 73. She had kept 11 letters from Eleanor Tanner. She preserved her grandmother, Grace's oral history, with care. She carried memories from childhood. Half-heard conversations children are presumed, too young to grasp, but never forget. For 38 years, she had said nothing publicly. Hatch spent 3 days with her. In his unpublished manuscript, hundreds of pages that survived in a single copy, he confessed he had begun searching for a mystery, and instead found a record of disciplined, collective determination. The mystery, he wrote, was never in the event. It was in the silence that followed. That silence endured because the truth was inconvenient to those who controlled what entered the record. Hatch spent 17 more years tracing fragments, church registries in Pennsylvania and Ohio, Quaker meeting notes, an account book in Greensboro with a single line dated October 17th, 1837. Party of 27 arrived. All well. Movement continued north. 3 days after leaving Harrow Hall, they were still together. His manuscript was never published in his lifetime. It passed quietly through private hands before reaching a university archive in the 1960s. Scholars have cited it. No monument marks the land. No plaque commemorates October 14th. The fields changed owners. The cotton gin was dismantled. The barn collapsed. The main house stood until 1879, then was demolished. The cabin row, where planning had unfolded, was reclaimed by vegetation. The well, once the center of daily life, appeared on a 1903 survey as Old Well Dry. It was eventually filled. The silence did its work, though, roughly, but silence is rarely permanent. A letter survives, a journal entry, a memory passed carefully through generations, a journalist asking questions decades too late and just in time. The conventional telling of escape stories often centers danger and pursuit. Those elements were real, but what happened at Harrow Hall was not chaos. It was organization, patience, 4 years of methodical preparation, shared information, managed fear. Reuben did not simply run. He engineered. Dia did not panic. She observed, calculated, waited. August did not flee blindly. He learned to read in stolen fragments of childhood, and carried that literacy into action years later. The silence that settled over Harrow Hall was not emptiness, it was purpose. When Hiram Cook drove his wagon up the lane on October 15th and felt something he could not name pressing in around him, he was standing in the aftermath of an impossibility made real. The people were already miles away. The breath had already been released. The night of October 14th was not the beginning. It was the culmination. The beginning was quieter still. Reuben sitting on his cabin step in late July, listening to August speak of a letter hidden in a study drawer, calculating in a voice too soft to carry. Then we have until October. In 1876, Hatch published a cautious article summarizing his findings. He received 23 letters, 11 hostile, 12 quietly affirming. One, unsigned, written in an unsteady hand, contained only this: "They made it, most of them. I know because I helped them. I have carried that knowledge for 39 years, and I am glad someone has finally asked." Hatch suspected the author, but never revealed the name. The letter remains in the manuscript, unattributed, and the land that was once Harrow Hall, flat, heavy, absorbing light, still exists somewhere in the Carolina backcountry. No marker stands there, no sign